Hello and welcome to the second session of this course, Scale and Demographic Measures of Migration. Well, the second session will be devoted to migration and demography, the relation between migration and demography, and how we regard migration as demographers. So, first question that I need to ask myself is, what's migration and who is the migrant? So in fact, the United Nations Migration Agency, IOM, defines a migrant as any person who is moving or has moved across an international border or within a state away from his or her habitual place of residence, regardless of what? Regardless of the person's legal status, whether the movement is voluntary or involuntary, what the causes for the movement are, or what the length of the study is. So these are the four conditions of defining migrants. So regardless of legal status, regardless whether of the nature of the movement, whether voluntary or involuntary, and also regardless of the cause of the movement and the length of stay. Of course, other definitions vary from this. So the definition of the United Nations is related to, it has a time bound, which is, or time reference, which is 1 year, and definitions of national states also varies. In some cases, the people are considered migrant if they stay more than 90 days only in a specific country. So this is about migration. So we need also to define the demography. What is demography? Demography is the statistical study of human population. So it encompasses the study of the size, structure, and distribution of this population and spatial change in them in respect to birth, death, and migration. So the demographic components of population change are births, deaths, and migration. By components mean the components of change, the components that affects the size of the population. The first thing is births. So births is one of the main components of population change, simply because births increase the population in a given state. Second, deaths. Deaths decrease the population in a given state. The third one is migration. And when talking about migration, actually, it has the influence of births and deaths. So people, when they leave their country and go to another country, they are considered, or have the impact of death in the country of origin, and as well as at the same time they have the impact of birth in the country of arrival. So when talking about births, as I mentioned, births increase the total number of population in a well-defined geographical territory. So the deaths decrease the total number of population in a well-defined geographical territory. And then when we talk about migration, as I mentioned, migration has the effect of both births and deaths, simply because migrants increase the total number of population in well-defined geographical territory when they arrive. When someone arrives in a specific country, they increase the population. So they work as the births, but they are not born at age 0. They are born at different age groups, okay? And also migration decreases the total number of population in a well-defined geographical territory when they depart this area. So they will leave specific area as if they are considered as deaths, and when they arrive in another area, they are considered as births. So they have in the triology of population change, births, deaths, and migration. Migration is acting the same as the two other wings of the population dynamics. So now if we exclude migration and talk only about the increase that occurs based on the births and deaths, the increase occurred by births and the decrease occurred by deaths. When we talk about this, we talk about what's called natural increase. Natural increase. So natural increase, in fact, is the difference between the number of births and the number of deaths recorded over a well-defined period, usually 1 year, and in a well-defined area of or country as well. So natural increase simply is the difference between births and deaths. So natural increase equals births minus deaths. So if in a given country the number of births is 1 million and number of deaths is 500,000, then the natural increase is 500,000. What's the meaning of natural increase? Means increase due to natural events. Natural biological events, because biological events, we call them births and deaths as natural events, or something occurs naturally. So this is about the natural increase. Now when we put migration, we can get an overall idea, a complete idea about the change or the dynamics of population in a specific area. So when we put migration, and because migration has two streams, the migration, people who leave the country and people who come to the country, so that we calculate what's called net migration, just to know the gain or loss related to migration. So how can we define net migration? Net migration is the difference between the number of immigrants, immigrants, people coming into an area, immigrants who come to the area, and the number of emigrants, just EM, people leaving an area over a well-defined period, usually 1 year. This is the definition of net migration. So just to get the balance between those who come and those who leave, to calculate the gain or loss of this specific country, just to put it together with births and deaths. So net migration actually equals migrants to the area or the states, those who are coming, which is called immigration, and minus migrants from the area or the states, those people who left the country in this specific period, which we call them emigrants, emigrants. This is the net migration or the net migration equation. Well, so now let's see the interaction between births, deaths, and migration. Or let's first see the interaction between births and deaths and its impact afterward on migration. So, how birth rates and death rates behave over time. This is because actually population change does not occur in short periods. It occurs in long periods. So the change in the population does not occur in very small or short periods like 1, 2, 3 years. You should follow the change in the population for long time, long period. So how this behavior also affects migration, how the change in births and death rates affects migration. So there is a model that summarizes the relation between births and death rates, and this model may answer this question, how this affects migration. The model that explains the relation between birth rates and death rates, or births and deaths, is called demographic transition. Demographic transition is the shift from high and low to low mortality and fertility. That is the shift from high fertility, high mortality, to low fertility, low mortality. So, based on the experience of Western Europe, historical experience of Western Europe. So in this graph, as you see, this is CBR means crude birth rate and CDR means crude death rate of England. Let's follow England for 150 years and see the behavior of crude birth rate and crude death rate. In the beginning, in year 1750, you will find that the birth and death rates are very high. So the birth rate was 40 and the death rate was 40. So for each 1,000 population, the 40 die. And for each 1,000 population, they produce 40 children. 40 births. So they increase by 40. So you can imagine that there is no natural increase. That in the year 1750, number of births equals number of deaths, which means that the population will stabilize, will be the same. Well, with the development of good health conditions, hygiene, the death rate decreased. The death rate decreased. So, but still the birth rate, the fertility is the same, simply because you can affect death rates by just introducing medicine. But you can not affect fertility rates or birth rates until you change the behavior of the people, you change the culture of the people. And usually changing the culture takes more time than just changing the health conditions using vaccines and drugs and medicine. So this is what happened in Western Europe. So when you see here, you see the gap between the two lines is attributed to the rapid decrease of birth death rates and the slow decrease in birth rates. So until they took like 150 years for England to reach to the balance between births and deaths. But note that the balance here was achieved with low fertility, low mortality, low birth rates, low death rates. So the birth rate was 40 and the death rate was 40 in the year 1750. In the year 2000, both of them were around 10, only 10. But at the same time, they became close to each other to the extent that the increase of the population of England, I'm talking by births and deaths, is almost none. Okay. Well, this is a sign of socioeconomic progress. Why? Because I mentioned that you can, by the way, you can import technology, you can import medicine, but you cannot import social patterns. Social patterns are developed in a long period. So you cannot also import them. So this affected actually because of that in developing countries, you can find that fertility rates are still high and mortality rates are almost the same as Europe. In some countries, they are less than Europe because of the structure of the population, as we will see in a moment. So it is a sign of socioeconomic progress to reach the low level of mortality and low level of fertility as well. Well, so these are the figures of the table of the graph that you've seen in the last slide. So I will go through them very quickly just to show you the first panel and the last panel. First panel, the crude birth rate is 40, crude death rate is 40, and in the last panel, crude birth rate is 11 and crude death rate is 10, which means that there's almost none. They are the same, but with a very low level, which means that if just because of natural increase, Europe will increase just 1 per 1,000. So each 1,000 every year will increase just 1 person. So 1,000 today, after 1 year, they will become 1,001 only. Well, so this is also a graphical presentation of the general model of the demographic transition. So it passes through stages. These stages, as I mentioned, are the historical experience of Western Europe. So they are not exactly the same as what the other countries practiced, because some countries are lagging off in the second and third stage, which is called the overpopulation problem or the overpopulation increase. So the first stage, almost they were high levels of fertility and mortality, and they are fluctuated to the extent that in some cases you find that mortality rates are less than fertility rates and the population is decreasing by natural increase. In the second and third phase, the mortality rates start to decrease sharply because the introduction of the medical equipments, medical interventions and innovations, and still the fertility rates are high, and their decrease is not the same as the decrease of mortality rates or death rates, and until they reach to the stability again, until they reach to the similar levels of fertility and mortality reach, this similar level of fertility or of mortality cannot be compared with the first stage. The first stage, similar level, was very high for both, but in the last stage, that the stage of Western Europe now and all Europe, the United States, there is a balance between births and deaths. I'm talking about what? Natural increase. Migration was not introduced till now to this model. Well, the historic change in fertility and mortality affects what's called the population pyramid. Population pyramid, as you can see, it replicates especially the first one for Democratic Republic of Congo is the same as, or looks like the pyramid of Giza in Egypt. This is the typical way of the population pyramid, and when you compare it with the slow growth of the United States, you can find it like a tower rather than a pyramid. And for the negative growth rate, like Germany, where the death rates are very high and the fertility rates are very low, negative growth rate, like deaths are more than births, you will find it like this shape. It starts to shrink from the bottom because the births are very low. So these shapes actually summarize and the two lines represent females and males, and each step represents a specific age group. So this is a summarization of the graphical presentation of the population of any country by sex and age. So, and you can see here that the base of the pyramid in Democratic Republic of Congo is white. That represents the vast majority, or like 40-50% of the population, are in very young ages, compared to the Germany, where the population is shrinking and number of population in the first age groups is lower than the population in the middle working age groups. And also you can find that in the top of the pyramid of the Democratic Republic of Congo, it is very slim, given the fact that the percent of the elderly is very low because of the life expectancy is low because of the health services and nutrition is not like developing countries. So this is how to read the population pyramid. Here we're talking about historical impact of change in fertility and mortality. Here's another also example. You can see that Africa the base is very wide because the young structure of the population. You can see also that like 40% or more than 1/3 of the population of North Africa is less than 15 years old, which is concentrated in the first three steps, from 0 to 4, from 10 to 14, and from 10 to 14, yes. And then the rest of the world, you can find it's almost slim, and Europe is very slim from in the beginning or in the first steps, which means that fertility is decreasing sharply because it is less than the replacement level, which is 2.1 births in average for live births in average for women. So the pyramid is shrinking, and the people will disappear maybe after 50 or 100 years if the levels of fertility and mortality continue to be as such. Well, also another example to make it more close to your mind, the Western Africa was very high level of fertility, and Western Europe with very low level of fertility. Well, so now let's link this with migration. So let's take a country like New Zealand, and the source of this data from the Statistics New Zealand. The first panel represents the years from year 2000 to year 2010, and the second column shows natural increase, that's the difference between births and deaths, and then the third column shows the migration to the country, because this is a receiving country, so the focus is always on migrants who are coming to the country. And then the total increase of the population due natural increase plus migration, and the percent of migration as part of the total increase. So here we introduce the third subject or topic, the third element, which is migration, reflected on immigration, because this is an immigration country, a receiving country. So for the year 2002, you can see that almost 26,000, these are the difference between births and deaths, natural increase. So the population increased due to the interaction between births and deaths by 26,000, but it's increased due to migration by the same amount, almost by 25. So the total increase of the population of New Zealand in 2002 was 52,000. 49% of them are attributed to migrants. Without migrants, the total population of New Zealand could have been less than the amount of 2002 by 25,000. Okay, so last year, which is 2010, the population increased 35,000 due to the interaction between births, and this is the difference between births minus deaths equal 35,000, and migrants to the country were almost 21,000. They represent 37% of the population. So the last column shows the percent contribution of migration to the increase of the population of New Zealand. So this shows the importance of migration to the extent that it reached in 2003 to more than 60% of the increase of the total population of New Zealand. Well, this is another example, graphical example from New Zealand, but focusing on Auckland, only the capital of New Zealand, between 1992 and 2015. And you can see the heads of the columns in red or brown color, as you can see them, are attributed to migration. So the lower panel of the pyramid with blue or light blue color is attributed to natural increase, and the complement of the cell of the column with red or brown, as you can see, is attributed to net migration. And here you can see again the importance of migration on population increase of a country like New Zealand. So in the year 2005, actually, the red part of the bar is more than the blue part of the bar, which means that the population of New Zealand increased by migration more than it's increased by natural increase, difference between births and deaths. This is another visual example of the importance of migration in increasing the populations of small countries like New Zealand. So, and here's also the another example, but accounts for the future, the prediction or the projection of the population and the influence of migration on the increase of the population of Auckland as well. So this is 5 years till year 2018, till year 2003, until the year 2043. And you can see also the heads of the bars with the red colors or brown colors are attributed to migration. So migration will continue to be responsible for the increase of population in New Zealand till the year 2043. Well, what about Northern Europe or Western Europe? So here's net immigration compared with births in some Western Europe countries. So in you can see the percent, the bar in purple is the natural increase, percent attributed to natural increase, and the other one, the blue color, is attributed to increase due to migration. And you can see here the bar in Luxembourg depends mainly on migration, and in Germany actually the net increase or the natural increase makes for decreasing the population of Germany, and also the same as in Italy. The Germany and Italy has the lowest fertility rates in Europe, and the increase will be only on attributed to migration. And without migration, the population of these countries will decrease, and which will affect the labor force, which will affect the social relations and many aspects of social and economic life of the populations. A country like Cyprus, for instance, they have high natural increase and same as high net migration to the island, for instance, and so on for other countries. Uh, well, this continue visualization also, and imagine the UK population from 2008 till 2081 in millions, with with the zero migration scenario and with three migration scenarios: high migration, low migration, and principal projection, or medium. We call the medium projection principal projection. So the zero migration means the net migration is zero, which means that no migration at all. We depend only on the difference between births and deaths, and we can see that the total population of the UK will decrease by time. Though with the three other scenarios, the principal scenario and the low scenario and high scenario, we'll find that the population of England will increase from 60 million to more than 90 million in the high scenario, and with about 85 million in the principal scenario or the medium scenario, and to about 75 or more with respect to the low migration scenario. So migration is important for these countries, and without it, population will decrease. So this is another example of a small country like Sweden with just migration, zero standard population, with no migration, zero migration, and with just increase attributed to natural increase. And you can see the difference. We start with 9 million of no migration, the population will decrease and reach like 8.6 million in 2050, but with migration, the 9 million will increase to 10.7 million. Okay. Also, migration or non-migration affects the aging population. So if you assume that Europe stopped receiving any migrants, the population will shrink, simply because Europe has an aging population, where most countries has 65 plus population of 20% and more in some countries, and no births. The births are shrinking, birth rates are decreasing. So which means that the population will be aging, will be very old. So low fertility and high life expectancy also lead to higher proportion of older population. So by 2050, for instance, Europe will have lost 48 million people of working age, because they will, by gradual transition, will be elderly, 65 plus, and also, but it will gain 58 million over 65. So they will be 58 million individuals over 65 years old. So the ratio between under 65 and over 65 in 2004 was 4 under 65 versus 1 over 65, which means that 20% elderly. By 2050, without migration, without heavy migration or high migration, the population of Europe will be 2 under 65 and 1 over 65, which means that the elderly population will be 1/3 of the population. Okay, so this is their problem. So why we care about it? Well, in fact, it is a problem. It is a universal problem. It's not only a problem for Europe, and it has to do with human mobility in general. It has to do with Europe and other countries as well. So it is a universal issue, not a European issue. Simply because 1 in 4 over 65. So migration, in this case, is it a solution to aging population? This is a justified or justifiable question. So does this mean that Europe will receive migrants? Now, it is their business. If they want to receive, they receive. But as a case study, let's elaborate on this. Let's talk about this. So it could be, of course, migration could be a solution. But it doesn't mean that Europe should open its doors to anyone. Because the composition of the population in Europe needs specific people. So it needs specific ages, needs specific skills. So they may not match The skills that are available in other regions of the world may not match what's needed by Europe or what's required for the economy of Europe. But migration in many ways could be a solution of the aging problem of Europe. But in fact, it raises many issues. The first issue is free movement within the EU, so they can solve their problem. They may not need us. Within the 28 countries of Europe or the large Europe, people can move from Poland to Italy or from Latvia to Serbia. They can have this balance internally. But the problem that most of the country, almost all the countries, have the same problem. Even Eastern Europe countries, they left their countries after joining the EU and worked in other countries. And this was not actually sufficient to maintain a balanced age structure in Europe. All people left alone as young people live in these countries. So when the young people in Eastern Europe left, they left young old people alone without anyone to take care of them. So there were also empty houses and lack of services in these countries due to migration of the whole families. Loss of young people needed by the economy. This is another issue. Well, so irregular migration, also another thing. So in some cases, Europe regulated some migrants who fit the economy, especially in Southern Europe, like Italy and Spain. So this also raises the issue of brain drain. So because Europe needs qualified persons, and qualified persons in the south are paid for. These poor governors just pay for their education. So this causes brain drain, and maybe these countries need them. So the example of Ghana, that was drained of its doctors and nurses for the United Kingdom, for instance. A country like Algeria was drained from their doctors and nurses for France, and so on. So the brain drain is another issue. The West, the South cannot give the North their qualifications and just leave the South drained of these qualifications if they are needed there. So migrant population raise questions of identity also, and we can see this in France, in Western Europe, and with the presence of Muslim societies, for instance, with the presence of Africans, with the presence of Asians. They have their own culture, they have their own beliefs, and they may not integrate easily into the population of host countries. So changing nature of personal and national identity. We talk about transnationalism and dual identity, and all of these issues also are to be considered when you talk about migration as solution for the balancing the age structure of the world population in different regions in the world. Europe also will be made up of increasingly diverse populations. This is good from the point of view of many people. It's not good from the point of view of right wings and the people who are against migration in many countries in Europe and in the West in general. That's all for this session. It is more to brainstorming about the interrelationships between births, deaths, and migration, and with an example or a case study of Europe and its relation with sending countries in the other regions in the world. Thank you, and see you in the third session. Bye.